The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Millbrook like a suffocating shroud, carrying with it the weight of whispered accusations and barely contained rage. Martha Collins had been dragged from her modest boarding house before dawn, broke over the Tennessee hills, her wrists bound with coarse rope that cut deep into her pale, trembling skin. The town square, usually reserved for cheerful market days and seasonal celebrations, had been transformed overnight into a grim amphitheater of judgment and condemnation. Adulteress. The word sliced through the humid morning air, like a razor-sharp blade, echoing off the surrounding buildings with venomous intensity. Sheriff Hawkins held the official warrant in his weathered hands, but those same hands trembled noticeably as he read the damning charges aloud to the assembled crowd. Martha Collins, you stand accused of corrupting the sacred sanctity of holy marriage, of deliberately destroying the God-fearing Whitman family and bringing unspeakable shame upon our righteous Christian community. The angry crowd pressed closer with each passing moment, their faces twisted into masks of righteous fury and moral indignation. Women who had once shared friendly pleasantries with Martha at Henderson's general store now glared at her with undisguised contempt burning in their eyes. Men who had respectfully tipped their worn hats to her just weeks before now spat contemptuously at her bare feet. The accusations had spread through Millbrook like an unstoppable wildfire after Thomas Whitman's distraught wife Margaret had discovered compromising, passionate letters hidden in her husband's private desk. Letters that Martha swore with every fiber of her being she had never written, never even seen before. She bewitched him with her sinful wiles, screamed Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, her normally melodious voice now cracking with raw emotion and unbridled fury. My poor innocent Thomas was a devoted, faithful husband until this. Shameless Jezebel sank her poisonous claws into his vulnerable soul. Martha's trembling legs buckled beneath her fragile frame as the overwhelming weight of their collective hatred crashed over her like a devastating tidal wave. She had tried desperately to explain her innocence, had pleaded with every person who would spare her even a moment's attention, but the evidence seemed completely insurmountable. The incriminating letters bore her full name, written in what appeared to everyone as her distinctive handwriting, detailing intimate, passionate encounters that had never occurred in any reality she knew. Someone had clearly orchestrated her complete downfall with meticulous, calculated precision. But who, and more importantly, why, remained a terrifying mystery that might very well die with her on this cursed morning. The execution stones had already been carefully gathered from the surrounding fields and arranged in neat, ominous pyramids around the square's weathered perimeter. Children who should have been preparing their lessons for school instead clutched jagged rocks in their small, innocent fists, their pure faces corrupted and twisted by the adults' insatiable thirst for violent vengeance. The morning sun climbed, steadily higher above the distant mountains, casting long, accusatory shadows that seemed to point directly at Martha's trembling, terrified form, like the very fingers of divine judgment. "Please, I beg you," she whispered desperately, her voice barely audible above the crowd's growing roar of bloodlust. I would never. I'm innocent of these charges." But her desperate words were completely swallowed by the mob's overwhelming hunger for retribution, their desperate need for justice drowning out any remote possibility of reason, mercy, or compassion. From his position at the crowd's outer edge, Daniel Mackenzie watched the horrific proceedings with steadily growing unease and moral discomfort. The widowed farmer had originally come to town on this particular morning for his weekly supplies and necessities, but the shocking commotion had drawn him inexorably into the packed square like a helpless moth to a deadly flame. His weathered, work-hardened hands gripped the leather reins of his faithful mare as he studied Martha's terror-stricken face intently, searching desperately for any signs of the guilt that everyone else in the community seemed so absolutely certain existed. What he saw instead was pure, unadulterated terror, the raw, desperate fear of an innocent woman who knew with horrible certainty that she was about to die a brutal death for crimes she hadn't committed, sins she had never even contemplated. Daniel recognized that particular expression of hopeless terror. He had seen it reflected in his own mirror every single day since his beloved wife Sarah's tragic death 6 long months ago, though his personal fear was of an entirely different nature. The paralyzing fear of continuing to live without purpose, without love, without any remaining hope for happiness or meaning. The bloodthirsty crowd's chanting grew progressively louder, more insistent, more demanding with each passing moment. "Stone the adulteress! Stone the filthy sinner! Let God's judgment be done!" The hateful words became a hypnotic, rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to synchronize perfectly with Martha's frantically racing heartbeat. She could feel death approaching, with terrifying certainty with each tick of the clock, could sense the mob's rapidly diminishing patience wearing dangerously thin as they waited eagerly for the sheriff to give the final, irreversible command. Sheriff Hawkins raised his trembling hand high above his head, and the entire packed square fell into an eerie, unnatural silence broken only by Martha's ragged, desperate breathing and the distant, mournful cry of a lonely dove somewhere in the surrounding hills. The pivotal moment stretched endlessly forward, suspended precariously between accusation and execution, between earthly justice and divine vengeance, between precious life and certain death. The morning breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, from the nearby meadows a cruel irony that spoke of life and beauty. While death loomed so close, Martha closed her eyes, trying to find some measure of peace in what she believed were her final moments, praying silently for forgiveness for sins she had never committed, and for strength to face her end with whatever dignity remained to her. By the authority vested in me by the great state of Tennessee and the expressed will of this righteous, God-fearing community, Sheriff Hawkins began formally, his voice carrying across the packed square with official gravity, I hereby pronounce sentence of death by stoning upon. Stop! The single, quietly spoken word cut through the thick morning air with unexpected authority and undeniable command. Daniel Mackenzie dismounted his faithful horse with deliberate, measured slowness, each careful movement watched intently by hundreds of suddenly uncertain eyes. He had spoken barely above a normal conversational tone, yet somehow his voice had carried clearly to every corner of the crowded square, penetrating the mob's consciousness like a sword through silk. Daniel, this matter ain't your concern, Sheriff Hawkins called out nervously, lowering his raised hand but attempting to maintain his official posture and authority. Go on home to your farm where you belong. This woman's fate was sealed the moment she chose sin and corruption over virtue and righteousness. But Daniel was already walking forward with steady determination, his worn leather boots echoing distinctly against the cobblestones with each measured, purposeful step. The angry crowd parted reluctantly before him, their previous certainty wavering noticeably in the face of his completely unexpected intervention. This was a man they all knew intimately, quiet, hard-working Daniel Mackenzie, whose beloved wife, Sarah, had been cherished by everyone in Millbrook before the cruel consumption had claimed her precious life. I said stop, Daniel repeated firmly, his naturally deep voice growing stronger and more commanding as he approached the center of the square. And I meant exactly what I said. Martha looked up through tears that blurred her vision completely, hardly daring to believe that someone, anyone at all, was actually willing to stand courageously between her and the mob's murderous fury. She had never spoken more than a few polite words to the grieving widower, had only seen him occasionally in passing at Sunday church services or Henderson's general store, always keeping respectfully to herself during the difficult months following his wife's tragic death. Daniel Mackenzie, you step aside right this instant, Mrs. Henderson shrieked furiously, her normally pleasant face now flushed bright red with righteous indignation. This shameless harlot deliberately destroyed a sacred marriage. She corrupted poor, innocent Thomas and drove his devoted wife Margaret to complete despair. The Holy Good Book demands divine justice. The Good Book demands a great many things, Daniel replied calmly, positioning himself squarely between Martha and the hostile crowd. His broad, powerful shoulders completely blocked their view of her trembling form, creating a human shield that trembled with barely controlled emotion. Including mercy and forgiveness, including the sacred presumption of innocence until guilt is proven beyond any reasonable doubt. The letters prove her overwhelming guilt. Thomas Whitman himself pushed aggressively through the crowd, his usually pristine appearance now completely disheveled, his bloodshot eyes wild with grief, rage, and what looked suspiciously like guilt. She wrote them with her own sinful hand. Every passionate word, every intimate detail of our forbidden encounters. My poor Margaret found them carefully hidden in my private desk drawer. Daniel turned to study Thomas carefully and deliberately, noting the man's distinctly defensive posture, the way his guilty eyes couldn't quite meet the crowd's collective gaze when he spoke of the alleged adulterous affair. "Strange observation," Daniel said slowly, thoughtfully. "In all my many years of knowing Martha Collins personally, I have never once seen her write so much as a simple shopping list. My dear Sarah used to help her regularly with any correspondence because Martha's handwriting was, well, let's just say it was quite distinctive, shaky and uncertain, nothing at all like the elegant flowing script I glimpsed on those supposed letters when Sheriff Hawkins held them up for everyone to see." A ripple of uncertain murmuring spread through the crowd as people began to seriously consider this troubling observation for the first time. Martha's elderly landlady, Mrs. Peterson, shifted uncomfortably near the front of the mob, her conscience clearly troubled. She knew beyond any doubt that Daniel spoke the absolute truth. Martha had always humbly requested help with any writing more complex than simply signing her own name. "You're being completely deceived by her masterful, innocent act," Thomas insisted, desperately, but his voice clearly lacked conviction now. Cold sweat beaded visibly on his pale forehead despite the morning's relatively cool temperature. She seduced me with her evil wiles and unnatural charms, made me forget my sacred vows, my holy duty to my poor suffering Margaret. Did she indeed? Daniel's tone remained conversational and measured, but there was unmistakable steel beneath his carefully chosen words. "Tell me something, Thomas. When exactly did these passionate encounters supposedly take place? Because Martha Collins works diligently at Patterson's textile mill 12 grueling hours every single day, 6 days each week. On Sundays, she faithfully attends morning worship service and then spends her entire afternoon caring devotedly for old Mrs. Carpenter's bedridden invalid son. I know this for absolute certain because my dear Sarah and I used to see her there, every week without fail, bringing precious medicine and reading Holy Scripture to the poor suffering boy." The crowd's enthusiasm was beginning to wane noticeably as doubt crept insidiously into their minds like morning fog rolling across the valley. These were people who had known Martha personally for 3 full years, who had witnessed her quiet devotion to honest work and Christian charity, who had never observed so much as an improper glance exchanged between her and any married man in the entire community. "The damning evidence speaks for itself," Sheriff Hawkins interjected desperately, sensing the dangerous shift in the mob's mood and trying frantically to restore their previous righteous order. "We have the incriminating letters, we have Thomas's sworn testimony, we have an innocent woman being deliberately railroaded to her death," Daniel interrupted forcefully, his voice rising powerfully for the first time since his intervention. "Began. And I absolutely will not stand by silently and watch it happen, not in my town. Not to someone whose only apparent crime is existing, while someone else desperately needed a convenient scapegoat." He turned to face the entire crowd directly, spreading his strong arms wide in a gesture that simultaneously protected Martha and boldly challenged every single one of her accusers. "You want to stone this woman to death? Then you'll have to stone me first. Every rock you throw, every act of violence you commit against her, you'll have to go through me to accomplish it." The profound silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Daniel Mackenzie wasn't just any ordinary farmer. He was a man deeply respected by the entire community, a devoted husband who had nursed his beloved wife through her final agonizing illness with tender, unwavering care, a true Christian who lived his faith quietly but completely, without fanfare or hypocrisy. To harm him would be to attack one of their very own, to cross a moral line that even righteous fury couldn't possibly justify. Martha sobbed quietly behind him, overwhelmed by the unexpected mercy of this man who barely knew her, yet was willing to risk absolutely everything to save her life. She could feel the crowd's dangerous momentum shifting palpably, their previous certainty crumbling steadily in the face of Daniel's unwavering resolve and his uncomfortable questions about the supposed evidence against her. The morning sun continued its steady climb, casting new shadows across the square as the standoff continued. Several people at the back of the crowd began to drift away quietly, suddenly remembering pressing business elsewhere, their confidence in Martha's guilt shaken by Daniel's brave intervention and logical observations. The tense standoff stretched, on for what felt like endless hours, but was probably only a few crucial minutes. Daniel remained completely motionless, his powerful arms spread wide in protective defiance, daring anyone in the increasingly uncertain crowd to make the first aggressive move against him. Behind him, Martha struggled desperately to understand why this man, this grieving widower she barely knew beyond polite social interactions, was willing to sacrifice absolutely everything to protect her innocent life. "Daniel, please listen to reason," Sheriff Hawkins said finally, his official voice now taking on a distinctly pleading quality that hadn't been there before. "You're making this situation much harder than it needs to be for everyone involved. The law is the law, and this community has spoken with one unified voice. Stand aside like a reasonable man and let divine justice take its proper course." "Divine justice?" Daniel's laugh was bitter and sharp, edged with deep pain and long-suppressed anger. "You dare call this mockery justice? Where was your precious justice when my beloved Sarah lay dying slowly in our bed, and half this so-called righteous town was too busy with their own petty affairs to even visit her? Where was justice when the town doctor refused to come treat her because we couldn't pay his full fee up front? But now, when it comes to destroying an innocent woman based on forged letters and obvious lies, suddenly everyone's eager to play God Almighty?" His passionate words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows, forcefully reminding them of their own moral failings, their shamefully selective application of Christian charity and community support. Several more people at the back of the crowd began to drift away quietly, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere, their faces flushed with shame and uncomfortable recognition of the truth in Daniel's accusations. Thomas Whitman, however, stepped forward with renewed desperation, his guilt and fear driving him to increasingly frantic measures. "You don't understand the situation, Daniel. She's not innocent like you think. He stopped abruptly, his pale face going even whiter as he realized he was about to reveal far too much. "She what exactly, Thomas?" Daniel pressed relentlessly, sensing weakness and vulnerability in the other man's obvious panic. "What exactly did she do that you haven't already publicly accused her of? What are you so afraid of revealing?" I, Thomas looked around frantically, desperately seeking support from a crowd that was no longer there for him. The mob had thinned considerably, leaving only the most committed accusers and a growing number of curious observers who were beginning to seriously question the narrative they had so readily accepted without proper investigation. Martha found her voice at last, strengthened by Daniel's incredible courage and the noticeable shift in the crowd's dangerous mood. "I never wrote those letters," she declared clearly, her words carrying distinctly in the morning air for all to hear. "I never had intimate relations with Thomas Whitman. I barely know the man beyond polite greetings at church and brief encounters at the general store." "Then how do you explain the damning physical evidence?" Mrs. Henderson demanded, though her voice now lacked its earlier vehemence and seemed to carry genuine uncertainty rather than righteous conviction. "Someone wanted me gone from this town," Martha replied, tears streaming steadily down her face but her voice growing stronger and more confident with each word she spoke. "Someone with a compelling reason to hate me, or perhaps more likely, someone with an urgent reason to protect themselves by destroying me completely." Daniel turned to look at her directly for the first time since placing himself between her and the mob's fury. What he saw reflected in her eyes wasn't guilt or deception. It was the exact same kind of desperate, raw honesty he had felt when pleading with God to save his dying wife. Vulnerable, genuine, completely authentic. "Who would want to hurt you, Martha?" he asked gently, his tone so completely different from the harsh interrogation she had endured that she almost broke down entirely. "What could you possibly have done to deserve this treatment?" I'm not entirely sure," she admitted hesitantly. "But 3 weeks ago I witnessed something. Something I probably shouldn't have seen, something that someone clearly doesn't want revealed." She paused, looking around nervously at the remaining crowd members, fear warring visibly with her desperate need to finally tell the complete truth. "What did you see?" Daniel encouraged softly, his steady presence giving her the strength to continue. Martha took a deep, shaking breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be a shocking revelation. I was walking home very late from Mrs. Carpenter's house. Her poor son had taken a serious turn for the worse, and I stayed to help through the crisis. As I passed the dark alley behind Patterson's bank, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. I saw Sheriff Hawkins meeting secretly with a man I didn't recognize, someone definitely not from around here. They were carefully exchanging a heavy bag that clinked with money, and the sheriff was handing over official papers from his office, documents that looked very important. The gasps from the remaining crowd were clearly audible now. All attention focused completely on Martha's stunning revelation. Sheriff Hawkins had gone rigid as a board, his guilty hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "That's absolutely preposterous," Hawkins sputtered desperately. "She's making up outrageous lies to save her worthless neck." "The mysterious man had a very distinctive scar," Martha continued, her voice gaining strength and conviction as she realized people were finally listening to her with genuine attention, running from his left ear all the way down to his jaw. He wore expensive clothes, fine materials, nothing like what honest folks around here could ever afford. And he called the sheriff Johnny, something I've never heard anyone else in this town do in all my years here. Several people in the crowd exchanged meaningful, knowing glances. There had indeed been persistent rumors about the sheriff's sudden, unexplained prosperity, his expensive new horse, the costly improvements to his modest house that seemed far beyond his official salary. "You lying, desperate whore," Hawkins exploded violently, but his emotional outburst only served to make him appear more guilty in everyone's eyes. "I'll not stand here and listen to these wild fabrications from a condemned adulteress." "Then perhaps," said a new, authoritative voice from the edge of the square, "you'd like to explain why my federal investigation into missing tax receipts led me directly to your office, Sheriff Hawkins?" Everyone turned in surprise to see a tall, imposing man in a dark suit approaching with confident strides, his federal marshal's badge gleaming brightly in the morning sun. Behind him walked two stern-faced deputies, their expressions grim and purposeful. "Marshal Thompson," Hawkins stammered, his face now pale as death. This is purely a local matter. A simple case of adultery and community justice and a case of attempted murder to silence an inconvenient witness," Marshal Thompson corrected firmly. "Miss Collins, I believe you witnessed Sheriff Hawkins receiving payment for stolen federal tax documents that were supposed to be forwarded to the federal treasury. Documents worth considerable money to certain individuals looking to avoid their legal obligations to the government." The remaining crowd members began backing away nervously, as the full scope of the conspiracy became crystal clear. Martha hadn't been targeted for adultery at all. She had been marked for death because she had accidentally witnessed a serious federal crime. Daniel felt a powerful wave of vindication wash over him, followed immediately by burning anger at how close they had all come to committing cold-blooded murder based on lies and fabricated evidence. He turned to Martha, seeing her in an entirely new light, not as a fallen woman but as an innocent victim who had nearly paid the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the right time. "The letters were expert forgeries," Marshal Thompson continued methodically. "Sheriff Hawkins paid Thomas Whitman handsomely to corroborate the false story and provide manufactured evidence of an affair that never happened. The plan was to have Miss Collins stoned to death for adultery, permanently eliminating the only witness to the theft while making it appear like righteous community justice. Thomas Whitman had already begun running desperately, pushing frantically through the stunned crowd in a pathetic attempt to escape his fate. The marshal's experienced deputies moved swiftly and efficiently, tackling him brutally before he could reach the edge of the square. The next several hours passed in a chaotic blur of intense activity, as federal deputies arrested both the corrupt Sheriff Hawkins and his co-conspirator Thomas Whitman, while Marshal Thompson took detailed, comprehensive statements from Martha and several shaken community members. The crowd dispersed gradually, people drifting away with expressions of deep shame and utter confusion, struggling to process how dangerously close they had all come to participating in judicial murder. Daniel remained steadfastly by Martha's side throughout the lengthy proceedings, offering quiet support and moral strength as she recounted her terrifying ordeal in detail to the federal authorities. When the formal interviews finally concluded, they found themselves alone in the square except for a few cleanup crews methodically removing the stones that had been prepared for her execution. "I don't know how to properly thank you," Martha said finally, her voice hoarse from emotional exhaustion. "You saved my life, and you didn't even really know me as a person." Daniel studied her face carefully in the warm afternoon light, seeing past the tear stains and lingering fear to the inner strength that had carried her through the darkest morning of her entire life. "I knew enough," he said simply, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I knew you were innocent. I knew you were completely alone. I knew it was the right thing to do." They began walking slowly away from the square, neither entirely sure where they were heading, but both desperately needing to distance themselves from the scene of near tragedy. The familiar town around them looked exactly the same as always, but everything fundamental had changed forever. Trust had been shattered, relationships permanently altered, basic assumptions questioned and found wanting. "Why?" Martha asked as they reached the peaceful edge of town where wildflowers grew in abundance. "Why did you believe in my innocence when absolutely no one else would?" Daniel was quiet for a long, contemplative moment, carefully considering the profound question. "My beloved Sarah used to say that you could tell a person's true character by watching closely how they treated those who couldn't possibly help them in return. I'd seen you countless times with Mrs. Carpenter's poor son, seen you working diligently at the mill, seen you at church services. You weren't putting on a show for anyone's benefit. You were just living your life with quiet decency and genuine Christian charity. That's simply not the behavior of someone who would destroy a marriage for passion or personal gain." Martha felt fresh tears threatening to fall, but these were completely different from the tears of terror she had shed that morning. These came from overwhelming gratitude and the incredible relief of being truly seen and understood by another human being. "What happens to us now?" she asked uncertainly. Daniel considered this carefully, weighing his words. His farm was prosperous enough, his house certainly large enough for 2 people, his life empty enough to welcome genuine companionship. But he also understood clearly that Martha had been through a severely traumatic ordeal, that she needed considerable time to heal and recover her sense of safety in the world. "Now you live," he said finally with quiet determination. "You go back to your work, your life, your daily routines. You let the town remember who you really are instead of who they thought you were. You give people time to feel properly ashamed of themselves, and then you decide whether you can find it in your heart to forgive them." "And what about you?" Martha asked with genuine concern. "You've made enemies today. There will certainly be people who resent your interference, who blame you for making them look foolish and cruel." Daniel shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both resignation and unwavering determination. "Let them harbor their resentment. Sarah used to say that doing the right thing was never about popularity. It was about being able to sleep peacefully at night knowing you hadn't stood by while evil triumphed." They had reached Martha's boarding house, a modest 2-story building that suddenly seemed like a palace compared to the violent death she had faced that morning. Mrs. Peterson appeared on the front porch, her weathered face a mixture of profound relief and deep embarrassment. "Martha, dear child," she called out warmly, I want you to know that your room will always be waiting for you here, and there won't be any questions about what happened today. Sometimes the entire town can be wrong, and it takes one good man to remind us all of our better angels and true Christian values." Martha nodded gratefully, then turned back to Daniel with hope beginning to bloom in her heart. "Will I see you again?" "If you want to," Daniel replied carefully, not wanting to presume anything. "I come to town every Saturday for supplies and necessities. Perhaps we could have coffee sometime. Talk about something other than attempted murder." "Thank you for being worth saving," he replied, then paused, his next words coming with visible difficulty. "Sarah would have liked you immensely. She always said the world needed more people willing to care for others without expecting anything in return." He rode away slowly as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, leaving Martha standing in front of her boarding house with tears in her eyes and genuine hope in her heart For the first time in months, the day that had begun with the terrifying promise of death had ended with the precious possibility of new life, new friendship, perhaps even new love when the time was right. Behind them, the town of Millbrook began the long, difficult process of examining its collective conscience and learning to live with the knowledge of what they had almost done. Some would learn and grow from the experience. Others would harbor resentment and blame. But Martha Collins would survive and thrive, protected by the memory of one man's courage and the gradual return of her community's better nature. The stones that had been gathered for her execution were eventually used to build a new school, transforming instruments of death into foundations for education and hope. And every Saturday, without fail, Daniel Mackenzie came to town for coffee and conversation, slowly building something beautiful from the ashes of the worst day either of them had ever lived through. In time, the scandal would fade and new stories would capture the town's attention. But Martha would never forget the moment when a grieving widower stepped between her and certain death, offering his own life as surety for hers. And Daniel would never regret the choice that had given both of their lives new meaning and purpose. Some acts of courage echo through eternity, changing not just the lives they save but the very character of the communities that witness them. On that dawn in Millbrook, Tennessee, one man's refusal to stand by and watch injustice triumph had redeemed them all, proving that sometimes it takes just one person willing to stand for truth to change everything.